Daniel Carter sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, staring at the eviction notice tacked to his apartment door. The paper trembled under the draft that seeped through the thin walls, as though mocking him. 32 years old, once filled with dreams of stability, he now faced the cold reality of being broke in a small Midwestern town where opportunity felt as rare as rainfall in August. His fridge held only a half-empty jar of peanut butter, a nearly stale loaf of bread, and a single apple bruised on one side. The town of Brookdale used to be a place of promise. Factories once hummed with activity, workers filled the diners every morning, and Friday nights were alive with football games and laughter spilling from porches. But those days were gone. The factory closed, the downtown storefronts were shuttered, and what remained was a silence that pressed down on everyone like an invisible weight. Daniel felt that silence most of all. He had tried. Oh, how he had tried. Applications sent to businesses, polite handshakes at interviews, and rehearsed lines of confidence. Yet each rejection chipped away at his pride. The longer it went on, the more he avoided old friends. He didn't want to see the pity in their eyes. Even more, he didn't want to hear that phrase whispered behind his back. What a waste. Still, there was something restless inside him, a whisper that he couldn't ignore, though he didn't yet recognize what it was. On that cold evening, as the sun dipped behind rows of bare trees and the streets grew quiet, he wrapped himself in a second-hand jacket and walked out. His feet carried him not toward solutions, but toward distraction. The downtown strip stretched before him like a shadow of itself. Street lamps buzzed, flickering against cracked sidewalks. A man leaned against the closed door of a hardware store, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." Daniel avoided his eyes. He knew the feeling of hunger too well, and something in him resisted facing a version of his possible future. He stopped at an old diner still clinging to life, its neon sign sputtering in faded red letters. Inside, the warmth and the scent of frying bacon greeted him, stirring both his stomach and his memory. He remembered sitting in that same booth years ago with friends after high school football games, their laughter so loud it echoed off the walls. Tonight, he sat alone ordering nothing but a cup of coffee he couldn't quite afford. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, set the cup before him. "Rough day?" she asked softly. "Something like that," Daniel replied, staring into the steam. "You're not the only one. This town's been through too much." Her words lingered, heavy but true. As Daniel sipped the bitter coffee, he thought about survival. He thought about what it meant to keep going when the world seemed determined to hold you down. There was a gnawing in his stomach, sharper than hunger, a longing for something more, something unseen. He didn't know it yet, but soon an act so small it might go unnoticed by anyone else would alter his path. A single choice, made in weakness yet born of something stronger, would ignite a change beyond his understanding. But before we get there, let me pause and remind you, if stories of resilience, struggle, and hope inspire you, make sure to subscribe to the channel. By joining us, you won't miss the powerful journey unfolding here. A journey that shows how even in the darkest places, light can break through. Outside the diner, the man with the cardboard sign was still there, shivering beneath the dim glow of the streetlight. Daniel watched him from the window, an unease stirring inside. He didn't yet know why he couldn't look away. Something was drawing him toward a decision that would test the very core of who he was. That night, as he walked home beneath a sky littered with stars barely visible against the town's dim haze, Daniel carried the weight of that image with him. A man with nothing but a plea for help. And Daniel, holding on to almost nothing himself, couldn't shake the thought, what if I had something to give? The question followed him all the way back to his apartment, where the eviction notice still clung to the door, waiting for an answer he wasn't yet ready to give. But deep within, something had begun to stir. Something that wouldn't let him stay the same. The next morning, Daniel woke with the hollow ache of hunger twisting in his stomach. He had eaten almost nothing the day before, saving what little he had left in hopes of stretching it another day. The half-empty jar of peanut butter sat on the counter like a cruel joke, its contents scraped thin against the glass. He unscrewed the lid, dipped a spoon inside and licked off the last traces. The flavor, faint and oily, was not enough to quiet the gnawing inside him. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Brookdale was waking up slowly. The sound of a diesel truck rumbled down Main Street, carrying supplies to a supermarket that seemed to thrive despite the struggles of the town. Daniel watched as cars pulled into the parking lot, shoppers stepping out in clean coats and polished shoes. They didn't look hungry. They didn't look desperate. He wondered what it was like to walk through those doors and fill a cart without counting every penny. Turning away, he felt a rush of bitterness. Pride wrapped itself around him like chains. He refused to call his sister for help, refused to step into the food pantry 2 blocks away, where others in town went for free groceries. To Daniel, doing so felt like an admission that he had failed, that he was less than the man he once believed himself to be. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside into the sharp wind. The sidewalks were slick with patches of ice, and his breath rose in white clouds before fading into the cold air. His stomach growled as he walked past the bakery on the corner. The smell of fresh bread drifted from its doors, warm and inviting, almost intoxicating. He lingered a moment, eyes drawn to the golden loaves stacked neatly in the window. A voice inside whispered, "You could buy one. Just one." But he checked his wallet, counting 3 crumpled $1 bills and some coins. Rent was due in less than a week, and even a few dollars mattered. "Morning, Daniel." He turned to see Mr. Henson, the bakery owner, standing by the door. A tall man with a clean apron, he looked Daniel up and down with a polite smile. "Haven't seen you in here lately." Daniel forced a smile. "Yeah, been trying to save money. You know how it is." Mr. Henson nodded, though Daniel caught the flicker of pity in his eyes. "Things will pick up." "They always do." Daniel mumbled a thanks and moved on quickly. Each word of sympathy felt like a knife to his pride. He didn't want pity. He wanted respect. He wanted to be seen as capable, not as a man barely hanging on. As he walked toward the edge of town, he passed rows of houses in varying states of decay. Some were freshly painted, Christmas wreaths still hanging on the doors though the season had passed. Others sagged under years of neglect, windows cracked, porches leaning. The contrast gnawed at him. How some families seemed untouched by hardship, while others collapsed under its weight. He wondered which side of the divide he truly belonged to. On the outskirts, a billboard loomed over the road, advertising a luxury car dealership 2 counties away. The gleaming vehicle on the sign mocked him, a symbol of a dream he once thought he could reach. He remembered test driving a used car fresh out of college, feeling certain that success was just around the corner. Now even bus fare was a stretch. His stomach growled again, louder this time, and he pressed a hand against it as if to quiet the sound. Hunger wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, gnawing at his sense of dignity, whispering that he was invisible, forgotten. He sat on a bench near the edge of a small park, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. A pair of teenagers walked by, sipping sodas and eating sandwiches from the deli down the street. They laughed freely, tossing crumbs to a cluster of pigeons at their feet. Daniel watched them, envy and shame rising together like a bitter tide. He thought about asking if they had a spare bite, but his pride wouldn't allow it. He would rather starve than be seen as begging. As the sky began to dim, Daniel rose and turned back toward his apartment. Each step was heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from the weight of choices pressing down on him. Survival demanded humility, yet pride demanded silence. Between the two, he was trapped. That night he lay awake on his thin mattress, the sound of his empty stomach echoing in the quiet room. He stared at the ceiling, imagining food, imagining relief, imagining a life where he no longer had to choose between hunger and dignity. And though he couldn't yet see it, a test was coming soon, one that would force him to decide not only how much he could endure, but what kind of man he truly wanted to be. The following day, Daniel wandered through the quieter side of Brookdale, where older homes stood shoulder to shoulder, their porches sagging but still alive with the marks of those who had endured. Here, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from chimneys, and the ground was littered with brittle leaves that the wind had failed to carry away. He walked aimlessly, unsure what he was looking for, when a voice called out to him from across the street. "Daniel Carter, is that you?" He turned to see Martha Johnson, bundled in a long wool coat, clutching a grocery bag in her wrinkled hands. She was well into her 70s, a widow who had lived in Brookdale her entire life. Her late husband had worked at the factory before it closed, and since then she survived on a modest pension. Despite her age and her struggles, Daniel remembered her as someone who always had a kind word for everyone. "Yes, Mrs. Johnson," Daniel replied, forcing a faint smile. "How are you doing these days?" "Oh, as well as an old woman can," she said with a chuckle. She shifted the bag in her arms and tilted her head. "But you, dear, you look thin. Are you eating enough?" The question made Daniel's stomach clench with both hunger and shame. He gave a small shrug, unwilling to confess the truth. "I'm managing." Martha studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as though she could see through his pride. Then, without hesitation, she extended the bag toward him. "Here, take some of this. I've got more than enough." Daniel raised his hands quickly. "No, Mrs. Johnson, I can't. You need that. I'll be fine." Her lips pressed together in a patient smile. "Daniel, do you know what my husband used to say? He'd say generosity isn't about what you have, but about what you're willing to give. I may not have much, but I'll always share what I do have. Now don't let your pride get in the way." He hesitated, torn between his growling stomach and his stubborn refusal to look weak. Martha, sensing his struggle, set the bag on the porch railing beside her and gestured firmly. "It's just a loaf of bread, some apples, and a little soup I made yesterday. Nothing fancy. But it will help, and I'll feel better knowing you're not going hungry." Reluctantly, Daniel reached out and took the bag. The warmth of the soup container radiated against his fingers, and for a moment he felt both grateful and defeated. "Thank you," he murmured. Martha's expression softened. "You're welcome. And remember, Daniel, everyone needs help now and then. Don't fool yourself into thinking you're the only one who struggles. The measure of a man isn't whether he falls. It's whether he lets others lift him back up." Her words struck him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He nodded, but inside he wrestled with the sting of being seen as needy. The pride that had kept him from the food pantry now bristled at accepting kindness from a woman living on far less than most. As he walked back toward his apartment, the grocery bag swinging at his side, Martha's words echoed in his head. "Generosity isn't about what you have." He thought about how she lived alone, surviving on so little, yet willing to give without hesitation. Meanwhile, he had spent days clinging to the scraps in his fridge, guarding them as though they were treasure. The bread inside the bag smelled faintly of yeast and comfort. He wanted to tear into it right there on the street, but another part of him resisted. A quiet voice inside whispered that the bread might serve a greater purpose, though he didn't yet know what that meant. Back in his small apartment, he set the bag on the table and sat down, staring at it as though it contained more than just food. Martha had given him something more than bread and soup. She had planted a thought that unsettled him, a thought he could not ignore. Maybe survival wasn't only about holding on, maybe it was about letting go. That night, as the wind rattled the thin windows, Daniel lay awake with hunger softened but pride still aching. He wondered what kind of man he was becoming, one who hoarded what little he had, or one who could one day give, even when it cost him everything. The question lingered, waiting for its answer. A few days later, Daniel found himself wandering again, the grocery bag from Martha long gone, its contents consumed with both gratitude and unease. He hadn't forgotten her words about generosity, but the idea of giving when he barely had enough for himself still felt impossible. That afternoon, as grey clouds pressed low over Brookdale and a cold wind cut through the streets, he drifted toward the city park, searching for a place to sit and escape his restless thoughts. The park, once a gathering place for families, was nearly empty. The playground equipment stood silent, paint peeling from the swings, while patches of frost clung stubbornly to the grass. On a bench near the fountain sat a man wrapped in a worn army jacket, his beard scruffy and streaked with grey. Beside him lay a battered duffel bag and a folded cardboard sign, its letters faded from weather. Vietnam veteran. Hungry. Please help. Daniel slowed, his chest tightening. He recognized the face. The man was Raymond Miller, though most people in town simply called him Ray. Years ago, Daniel had seen him at the grocery store, always polite but withdrawn. Somewhere along the way, Ray had slipped through the cracks, ending up here, homeless and forgotten by most. As Daniel passed, Ray lifted his head. His eyes, sharp yet weary, studied him. "Got a minute, son?" Daniel hesitated, then sat on the far edge of the bench. "Yeah, just passing through." Ray gave a dry laugh. "Aren't we all?" He tapped the sign with a calloused finger. "Some of us just got stuck passing a little longer in one place." For a moment neither spoke. The air smelled faintly of smoke from a nearby chimney, mingled with the metallic bite of winter. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his own hunger gnawing at him. "You look like you're carrying something heavy," Ray finally said. "Not just your stomach either. I can see it in your eyes." Daniel forced a laugh, though it came out flat. "Guess it's not hard to tell. Things haven't exactly been working out." Ray leaned back, his gaze fixed on the grey sky. "They never do." "Not the way we expect. I came back from war thinking I'd have a job, a family, respect. Instead, I got nightmares and a country that didn't know what to do with me. I held on as long as I could. Then one day, it all slipped away." The bluntness of his words cut through Daniel. He glanced at the duffel bag, the man's entire life stuffed inside. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked quietly. "Living like this, I mean." Ray turned to him, his expression hard but honest. "Of course it bothers me. Every night I sleep out here, I think about the warmth of a bed. But I stopped waiting for the world to save me. Out here, you learn to take what comes. Dignity isn't about where you lay your head. It's about whether you still know who you are." Daniel's throat tightened. Pride and fear wrestled inside him. He thought of Martha's lesson, of her willingness to give despite having so little. He thought of his own refusal to accept help until desperation forced him. And now here was Ray, stripped of nearly everything, yet still clinging to identity. "Do you still believe?" Daniel asked suddenly. Ray raised an eyebrow. "Believe in what?" "In God." "In anything." For a long moment Ray didn't answer. Then he sighed, his breath forming a pale cloud. "I believed once. I prayed in foxholes, begged him to keep me alive. Sometimes he did. Other times I watched good men fall. These days I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. Kindness still matters. A meal, a word, a moment of respect. Those things mean more out here than any sermon." The words lodged deep in Daniel's chest. He wanted to argue, to push back, but instead he nodded. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Ray gave him a faint smile. "Son, if you've still got something to give, don't wait until it's all gone. Because when you've got nothing left, you'll wish someone else had thought the same." The truth of it stung. Daniel sat silently, staring at the frozen fountain, the sound of the wind rustling through barren branches above. Hunger pressed at him, but deeper still was a question he could no longer ignore. If generosity mattered more than survival, what would he do when faced with the choice? The answer, though not yet spoken, was coming for him faster than he knew. The next evening, Daniel counted his money on the kitchen table. $3 and some loose change. Not enough to cover rent, not enough to stretch into the week ahead. His stomach ached with emptiness, sharper now, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. He considered skipping another meal, but the thought made his head spin. He needed something, anything, to keep going. He pulled on his jacket and walked toward the bakery. The air was brittle with cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke and fried food from a diner down the street. His hands stayed in his pockets, clenched tightly around the coins, as if afraid they might vanish. When he reached the bakery, the warm smell of bread drifted out to meet him, comforting and cruel all at once. Inside, the shelves were lined with loaves, their golden crusts glowing beneath the soft lights. He hesitated before stepping in, but hunger drove him forward. "Evening, Daniel," Mr. Henson said from behind the counter. "You caught us just in time. We've only got a few loaves left." Daniel nodded, pushing his crumpled bills across the counter. "One loaf, please." The man handed it over, still warm in its paper bag. Daniel clutched it like treasure, the weight of it grounding him. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of relief. This bread would keep him going. at least for a little while. As he stepped back into the cold night, his eyes caught a figure slumped against the wall near the alley. Ray, the veteran, shivering beneath his jacket. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight against chattering teeth. The cardboard sign lay on the ground beside him. Daniel stopped in his tracks. The bread in his hands suddenly felt heavier, as if it carried more than flour and yeast. Hunger roared inside him, demanding he keep walking, demanding he hold on to what little he had. But another voice whispered just as strongly, "What about him?" Ray stirred and opened his eyes. "Evening," he rasped, his voice thin. "Didn't mean to scare you. Just cold." Daniel swallowed hard. "Have you eaten today?" Ray gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Not really." Tried to, but it didn't work out. He glanced at the bag in Daniel's hands, then quickly looked away. "Don't worry about me, you've got your own problems." The words stung. Daniel's grip tightened on the loaf. His pride screamed to keep it. After all, he had paid for it. He had earned it with the last of his money. But Martha's words returned like an echo. Generosity isn't about what you have, but about what you're willing to give. He tore the loaf in half, holding one piece out to Ray. His hand shook as he did it, torn between desperation and compassion. Ray stared at him, surprised. "You sure?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah." "You need it more than I do." Ray accepted the bread with trembling hands, breaking off a small bite and chewing slowly. "God bless you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Daniel's stomach twisted with emptiness as he looked at the remaining half in his hands. For a moment, he thought he could walk away and keep it for himself. But then he saw the way Ray held that bread, as if it were life itself, and something inside him shifted. Without a word, he extended the other half too. Ray blinked, stunned. "No, son, keep some for yourself." Daniel forced a faint smile. "It's okay, I'll manage." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt lighter, as though the burden he had been carrying had loosened. Hunger still gnawed at him, but it was different now, almost secondary. Something deeper filled the hollow space inside him, not food, but a strange, quiet peace. As he walked home, his hands empty, the cold sharper than ever, he wondered what he had just done. He had nothing left, yet he didn't regret it. Instead, he carried with him the weight of a choice that felt both reckless and right. He couldn't know it yet, but that single act, that surrender of his last piece of bread, would mark the beginning of a change far greater than hunger or pride. It was a decision that would open a door he hadn't even known existed. That night, Daniel returned to his apartment empty-handed. The air inside was colder than usual, the thin walls offering little protection against the bitter wind outside. He sat on the edge of his bed, the silence pressing down on him. His body trembled, not only from the chill, but from the hunger that now had no promise of relief. Yet strangely, he didn't feel regret. He could still see Ray's eyes when he handed him the bread, eyes filled with something between gratitude and disbelief. That image stayed with him, warming a part of him his stomach could not. He lay back, staring at the cracked ceiling. His body ached, his mind swam in exhaustion. As sleep slowly crept over him, the weight of the day seemed to fade. But in the darkness of slumber, something else stirred, something he had never experienced before. At first it was only light, soft, golden, surrounding him like a dawn that never ended. Then a presence, gentle yet commanding, filled the space. Daniel felt both exposed and embraced, as if every part of him was known yet accepted. His heart pounded as he realized he wasn't alone. Daniel. The voice was unlike any he had ever heard, calm, steady, filled with authority and compassion. He turned and saw a figure standing before him. The man's face was not blinding, but radiant with a warmth that drew Daniel in. His eyes, deep and clear, seemed to pierce through every fear, every doubt, every wound. Daniel knew instantly who it was, though he had never seen him before. "Jesus!" The words slipped out in a whisper. The figure stepped closer, nodding gently. "You gave what you did not have to spare. You gave not because it was easy, but because it cost you, and what you gave." He paused, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. "You gave to me." Daniel's throat tightened. "But it was just bread. The last thing I had." "To you it was bread," Jesus replied, his voice rich with certainty, "but to him it was hope. To me it was love, and love given freely is never small." Tears burned at the corners of Daniel's eyes. He thought of his failures, his pride, the ways he had resisted help, the bitterness that had taken root in him. "I don't have anything else," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I'm empty." Jesus placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was steady, grounding, yet filled with a strength Daniel had never known. "What you gave tonight is more than most ever will, and because you gave, I will give you something the world cannot take away." Daniel shook his head slightly. "But I don't deserve it. I've wasted so much time. I've been selfish." "Grace," Jesus said softly, "is not earned, it is given. And tonight, Daniel, you opened your hands. Now keep them open, and you will see what I will do." The words sank into him like living water, filling the dry places of his soul. The hunger in his body remained, but the emptiness in his spirit began to fade, replaced by something he couldn't explain. Peace, deep and steady, like an anchor. "Do not be afraid of tomorrow," Jesus continued. "Walk forward. Trust. What you gave away was not lost. It was the beginning of what will be found." Daniel wanted to speak, to ask what awaited him, but the light began to soften, fading back into the shadows of sleep. The warmth lingered, the presence still near, until finally his eyes opened again. He was back in his cold apartment, the ceiling above unchanged, the night silent around him. Yet everything felt different. His body was weak, his stomach still aching, but his heart was steady in a way it had never been before. Daniel sat up slowly, the memory of the encounter vivid, alive, undeniable. Had it been a dream? A vision? His mind could not explain it, but his soul knew the truth. He had seen him. He had heard him. And nothing would ever be the same again. Morning crept into Daniel's apartment through the blinds, streaks of pale light spreading across the worn carpet. He stirred awake slowly, his body heavy with weakness, but his mind was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. The memory of the night clung to him, vivid and unshakable. The light, the voice, the touch that had steadied his soul. It wasn't a dream. He knew it. He had seen Jesus. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel crushed beneath the weight of despair. The hunger was still there, sharp and demanding, but something deeper had shifted. There was a quiet strength rising inside him, as though the words he had heard were still echoing in his chest. "What you gave away was not lost. It was the beginning of what will be found." He sat up slowly, pressing a hand to his stomach. It growled, a reminder of his reality, yet it no longer defined him. The emptiness in his body could not compete with the fullness beginning to take root in his spirit. After washing his face with cold water from the sink, he stared at himself in the mirror. His reflection looked the same. Tired eyes, scruffy jawline, worry etched in every line. But behind the weariness was something else, resolve. "I can't keep living like this," he whispered. "I've got to move forward." The streets of Brookdale were just waking as he stepped outside. Frost clung to the edges of car windows, and neighbors hurried past with coffee cups in hand, scarves wrapped tight against the chill. Daniel walked with no clear destination, but with a new sense of purpose. He had avoided people for too long, ashamed of his failures. Today, though, he felt compelled to face the world again. He stopped by the local library, its doors creaking as he pushed them open. The familiar scent of old books wrapped around him, a comfort from years past. He sat at one of the computers, pulling up job listings he had seen countless times before. Only this time he didn't close the screen in defeat. He typed applications with renewed focus, sending them out one after another, his fingers steady. Hours passed. His stomach protested, but he pressed on, refusing to give in to despair. At one point, the librarian, a grey-haired man named Mr. Owens, passed by and paused. "Haven't seen you in here for a while, Daniel," he said kindly. Daniel looked up, managing a small smile. "Yeah, I've been figuring things out," Trying again. Mr. Owens nodded approvingly. That's good. Don't stop. Persistence gets noticed even if it doesn't feel like it. The words encouraged him more than the man realized. Daniel returned to the screen, determination anchoring him. He wasn't guaranteed success, but for the first time in years, he felt hope. By late afternoon, he left the library and walked through town. The sight of Ray's usual bench made him pause. The veteran wasn't there today, but the memory of his gratitude lingered. Daniel touched the back of the bench gently, a reminder of the night before, and whispered to himself, "It wasn't for nothing." As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Daniel headed home. Each step was still heavy, but it carried purpose. He felt like a man learning to walk again after being paralyzed by fear. Inside his apartment, the cold greeted him, but instead of despair, he felt determination. He grabbed a notebook from the drawer and began to write, not just lists of jobs, but goals. Simple ones. Call Emily, attend church, volunteer, try again tomorrow. Each line was a small promise to himself that he wasn't done, that the story of his life wasn't finished. Before he closed the notebook, he wrote one last sentence at the bottom of the page. Keep your hands open. That night, though hunger still gnawed at him, he slept with peace. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't facing it the same way anymore. Something inside had awakened, and it would not let him turn back. The next week tested Daniel in ways he hadn't expected. The strength he had woken with after that vision had carried him into action, but action did not guarantee success. Each morning he rose early, combed his hair, and walked into town with a folder of resumes tucked under his arm. His steps were steady, his head held higher than before, but rejection met him at every turn. At the grocery store, the manager skimmed his application and shook his head. "Sorry, we need someone with recent experience. Maybe next time." At the gas station, the clerk behind the counter gave a half smile. "We already filled the position yesterday. Wish you'd come in sooner." At the diner where he had once spent late nights with friends, the owner didn't even look up as he slid the resume back across the counter. "We're not hiring." Each no stung like a slap. By the third day, Daniel felt the sharp edges of disappointment digging into him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but rejection gnawed deeper at his spirit. Still, he reminded himself of the words he had heard. "Do not be afraid of tomorrow. Keep your hands open." He repeated them like a prayer under his breath as he walked home through the cold. One afternoon, he sat on a bench outside the library, watching people hurry by with bags of groceries, briefcases, children tugging at their coats. He felt invisible again, the same ache of insignificance pressing down. For a moment, bitterness rose like bile. "What's the point of trying?" he thought. "No one sees me. No one wants me." The whisper of doubt grew louder. "Go back to hiding. Stop embarrassing yourself. Stop pretending things will change." He clenched his fists, fighting the temptation to give in. "No," he muttered to himself. "Not this time. I can't go back." Just then, an older man in a suit paused nearby, looking down at Daniel. "You okay, son?" Daniel forced a thin smile. "Yeah, just waiting." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded and walked on. The simple exchange left Daniel both unsettled and strangely strengthened. He wasn't invisible. Someone had noticed. That evening, he returned to his apartment, weary but still determined. He opened his notebook and wrote down the names of every place he had applied, leaving space beside each one. He circled the words he had written days earlier. "Keep your hands open." The phrase reminded him that persistence itself was an act of faith, even when the results weren't immediate. But the next morning brought another blow. A letter slid under his door from the landlord. Final notice. Rent was due in 3 days, or eviction would follow. The paper shook in his hands. His chest tightened as fear rushed in like a wave. For a long moment, he sat frozen, the temptation to give up pressing down harder than ever. He wanted to tear the letter up, to collapse into despair, to let the weight crush him completely. Instead, he set it on the table and whispered, "I can't do this alone. God, if you're real, if last night wasn't just my imagination, I need you now." The words were raw, unpolished, but they steadied him. He didn't receive an answer in that moment, no glowing light or audible voice. But he felt the faintest sense of being heard, and that was enough to stand again. The days that followed were no easier. Interviewers dismissed him, some with politeness, others with indifference. The rejection letters stacked up like bricks on his chest. Yet something inside him refused to collapse. Each night, as he crossed out another no in his notebook, he told himself, "I'm still here. I'm still standing." And though he didn't yet realize it, the persistence itself was shaping him, stripping away the bitterness, forcing him to dig deeper, to trust more, to wait for a door that hadn't yet appeared. On the morning after another fruitless interview, Daniel returned to his apartment to find a small envelope slipped beneath his door. At first he assumed it was another notice from the landlord, and his chest tightened with dread, but when he bent to pick it up, he froze. The handwriting on the front was familiar, looping letters that stirred a memory he had long buried. His sister. He sat at the table, the envelope trembling in his hands. It had been years since he'd last spoken to Emily. Their relationship had unraveled after their parents passed away, tension building into sharp words that neither had taken back. She had accused him of being irresponsible, of wasting his opportunities. He had accused her of being self-righteous, too eager to lecture. Pride had done the rest, erecting a wall between them that had stood untouched ever since. Now staring at her handwriting, Daniel hesitated. Part of him wanted to toss it aside, afraid of what it might say. But hunger for connection, a hunger deeper than any empty stomach, pushed him to tear it open. "Dear Daniel," the letter began. The sight of his name in her hand made his throat tighten. He read on. "I don't know if this letter will reach you in time, or if you'll even want to read it. I've thought about writing for months, but pride kept stopping me. The truth is, I miss you. I don't like how we left things. Life's too short to stay angry." Daniel leaned back, the words blurring as his eyes burned. Emily's voice came alive in his mind, steady and warm, the way it had sounded when they were younger. The letter continued. "I've heard Brookdale has been struggling. I can't imagine what it's been like for you. If you need a fresh start, I want you to know you're welcome here. I live in Chicago now, working as a nurse. It's not easy, but there are opportunities here, and I'd help however I can. You don't have to say yes, but if you're willing, I'll be waiting." It was signed simply, "Love, Emily." Daniel set the letter down, his hands trembling. A swirl of emotions stormed inside him. Relief, shame, longing, and fear. The thought of seeing Emily again stirred hope, but it also reopened wounds. He remembered the night of their fight, her tears, his anger, the door slamming shut. Could they really go back? Could forgiveness undo the years of silence? He pressed the letter to his chest, whispering into the empty room. "Why now, Emily? Why after all this time?" The clock ticked on the wall, the only answer. Later that evening he walked the streets, the letter folded neatly in his pocket. Every step echoed with uncertainty. Chicago, a city of opportunities, but also of noise, crowds, and challenges he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. Yet here was his sister, offering a hand after all these years. Was this the door he had been praying for? Sitting on a bench near the park, Daniel pulled the letter out again, reading it under the dim glow of a streetlight. A group of children laughed nearby, their breath rising in clouds as they played tag. Their joy was unfiltered, uncomplicated, so unlike the heaviness in his chest. Ray's voice echoed in his memory. "If you've still got something to give, don't wait until it's all gone." Martha's words followed. "The measure of a man isn't whether he falls, it's whether he lets others lift him back up." Now Emily's voice joined them, written but no less real. "I'll be waiting." Daniel folded the letter once more and slipped it into his coat. The decision wasn't made yet, but something inside him shifted. Maybe reconciliation was possible. Maybe healing could begin. And though fear lingered, so did a fragile hope that stepping toward Emily might not only restore family, but also lead him toward the future he was still searching for. 2 weeks later, Daniel stepped off a bus into the heart of Chicago. The city roared around him, Cars honking, sirens wailing in the distance, voices rising and falling in a dozen accents. Skyscrapers stretched into the grey sky, their glass faces catching slivers of pale winter light. The sheer size of it all made him dizzy. Brookdale felt like a faded photograph compared to this. Here everything pulsed with movement, urgency, and noise. He clutched the strap of his worn duffel bag, pulling his jacket tighter against the biting wind. The bus ride had drained the last of his savings, leaving only a few coins in his pocket. He had Emily's address written on a slip of paper, but pride held him back from going there immediately. He wanted to stand on his own to prove he could manage before facing his sister again. His first night in the city was spent in a run-down motel on the west side, the kind where walls were thin and locks unreliable. The sheets smelled faintly of cigarettes, and the radiator clanged more than it heated, but it was shelter. Daniel lay awake listening to the muffled arguments in the hallway, his heart restless. The next morning he set out in search of work. The streets overflowed with people, rushing in every direction. He followed them, weaving through crowded sidewalks, passing food trucks and coffee shops packed with customers. His stomach ached at the sight of warm sandwiches and steaming cups of soup, but money kept him moving forward. He stopped at a warehouse posting a "Help Wanted" sign. Inside, a man in a reflective vest eyed him skeptically. "You got experience with forklifts?" "No, but I'm willing to learn," Daniel answered quickly. The man shook his head. "We need people ready now. Try somewhere else." At a construction site, he asked the foreman about openings. The man laughed. "We've got a waiting list. Come back in a month." By evening, Daniel's feet ached, his body heavy with exhaustion. He sat on the steps of a subway entrance, watching people flow past with shopping bags and briefcases, earbuds tucked in as if the world around them didn't exist. He had never felt smaller, more out of place. A young man passed, glancing down at him. "Get a job," he muttered under his breath, assuming Daniel was homeless. The words burned, cutting deeper than the cold wind. Daniel wanted to shout back that he was trying, that he was more than what he looked like, but his voice stuck in his throat. That night, unable to afford another motel, Daniel found himself at a shelter on the south side. The building was crowded, the air thick with sweat and desperation. Men and women of all ages lined up for a meal, simple soup and bread, but to them, it was life. Daniel hesitated before stepping into line, pride still whispering in his ear, but hunger silenced it. As he sat with his tray, an older man across the table spoke. "First time here?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, just got into the city." The man gave a knowing smile. "Don't worry. Everyone's first night feels rough. You'll figure it out. Just don't lose yourself out here." The words stayed with him as he tried to sleep on a narrow cot in the crowded dormitory. The shelter was noisy, but beneath the noise was something else, survival. Each person carried their own story of loss, each one forced to fight for another chance. Daniel lay awake staring at the ceiling, the slip of paper with Emily's address folded in his pocket. He could go to her tomorrow, knock on her door and accept her help, but fear kept him still. He wanted to face her as a man who had already found his footing, not one lost in the chaos of the city. Yet as the hours dragged on, he wondered how long he could keep running from the truth. For 3 days, Daniel delayed going to Emily's apartment. Each morning he told himself he needed more time. Time to find a job. Time to look less broken. Time to prove he could stand on his own. But each night, lying on the hard cot in the shelter, the weight of the folded slip of paper in his pocket grew heavier. By the 4th day he could no longer ignore it. He rose early, washed his face in the shelter's restroom, and walked across the city with trembling hands. Emily's building was on the north side, a modest brick apartment complex surrounded by narrow streets lined with parked cars. Compared to the cracked sidewalks and boarded windows near the shelter, it felt like another world. As he climbed the steps, his chest tightened. He wondered if she would even open the door, or worse, if she regretted sending the letter at all. He knocked softly. For a moment there was no answer, and panic surged. Then the door opened, and there she was, Emily. Her dark hair was tied back, her eyes alert but softened by surprise. "Daniel?" she said, her voice uncertain. He nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah." "It's me." For a long second they just stood there, the silence thick with all the years between them. Then Emily stepped aside. "Come in." The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a reminder of her work at the hospital. The space was small but neat, every corner cared for. Daniel stood awkwardly by the door, unsure where to begin. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Emily said, setting her coffee mug on the counter. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned back to him. Daniel shifted his weight. "I almost didn't. I didn't know if you even wanted to see me." Her eyes softened. "Of course I wanted to see you. Why do you think I wrote the letter?" He swallowed hard, shame tightening his chest. "Because you felt sorry for me. And maybe you should. I've messed up, Em. I've wasted so much time, burned bridges I didn't know how to rebuild. I thought I had everything figured out once, and then I lost it all. And I blamed you when I shouldn't have." Emily stepped closer, her voice steady. "Daniel, I wasn't perfect either. I said things I regret. I judged you harshly when you needed grace. We both let pride get in the way. But you're my brother, that hasn't changed." The words cracked something open inside him. He lowered his head, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Emily, for everything I said, for shutting you out, for not being the brother you deserved." Emily's hand touched his arm gently. "And I'm sorry too. I never stopped caring about you. I just didn't know how to reach you." Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was healing. Daniel lifted his head, tears burning his eyes, and for the first time in years, he saw not the distance between them, but the bond that had always remained. "Do you really think there's a chance for me here?" he asked quietly. Emily smiled, a small but certain smile. "I do. Chicago isn't easy, but there are opportunities, and you don't have to do it alone. You've got me." Daniel let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "I don't deserve that." "Maybe not," Emily replied softly. "But that's what grace is. None of us deserve it. We just choose to give it anyway." Her words echoed the ones Daniel had heard in his vision, reminding him that grace wasn't earned, but offered. In that moment he realized that reconciliation wasn't just about family, it was about living out the very truth he had been shown. As he sat down at her table, the distance between them finally bridged, he felt something inside him settle. It wasn't the end of his struggles, but it was the beginning of healing he hadn't dared to believe possible. Over the next few days, Daniel stayed with Emily. She gave him the couch, a blanket, and quiet patience as he tried to adjust to the new rhythm of her world. Every morning she left early for the hospital, her scrubs smelling faintly of antiseptic, her eyes carrying both fatigue and purpose. Daniel admired her strength, but also felt the weight of his own uncertainty pressing harder. He still had no job, no income, nothing to prove that his life was moving forward. One evening, Emily returned home with a small paper bag of groceries. She set them on the counter and glanced at Daniel, who was sitting at the table with his notebook. "How did the applications go today?" Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Same story. Either I don't have the right experience or the position's already filled. I walked half the city, Em. Feels like I'm invisible out there." Emily pulled out a loaf of bread and a carton of milk, placing them neatly in the fridge. "You're not invisible. You just haven't found the right door yet." Her words lingered in his mind long after dinner. The right door. He wanted to believe one would open, but each rejection had chipped away at his hope. 2 days later, Emily invited him to join her at church. Daniel hesitated, memories of sermons and Sunday mornings from childhood tugging at him, but he couldn't ignore the tug in his heart. He agreed. The church was modest, tucked between 2 storefronts on a busy street. Inside, warm light filled the room, and the air hummed with the sound of voices lifted in song. Daniel sat quietly beside Emily, uneasy at first, until the pastor began to speak. Pastor Williams was a tall man with a kind but steady presence. His message wasn't polished with fancy words. It was simple, direct, and full of conviction. When one door closes, God isn't punishing you. He's redirecting you. But you have to be willing to walk through the door. He opens, even if it doesn't look like what you expected. Daniel felt the words strike him deeply, as if they were spoken just for him. After the service, Emily introduced him to the pastor. "Pastor Williams, this is my brother Daniel," she said warmly. The pastor extended his hand. "Good to meet you, son. Your sister tells me you've been looking for work." Daniel shook his hand firmly, though his voice faltered. "Yeah, it hasn't been easy." Pastor Williams studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I run a food bank through the church. We're always short on volunteers. It won't pay, at least not in money, but it'll keep you busy, and you'll be helping people who need it." Daniel hesitated. His pride flared again, whispering that volunteer work wouldn't pay rent, wouldn't prove anything. But another voice, softer yet stronger, reminded him of the bread he had given to Ray, of the words Jesus had spoken in his vision. "What you gave to me." He nodded slowly. "I'll do it." The pastor's eyes lit with approval. "Good. Be there tomorrow morning. You'll see. It's more than handing out food. It's about giving dignity back to people who've been overlooked." "Something tells me you'll understand that." That night, back at Emily's apartment, Daniel lay awake on the couch. He thought of the shelter, of Ray on the bench, of Martha offering bread from her own small kitchen. Now it was his turn to step into that same kind of giving. It didn't erase his struggles, but for the first time in weeks, he felt anticipation instead of dread. The next day, as he prepared to walk into the church basement to begin volunteering, he whispered to himself, "Maybe this is the door." The church basement smelled faintly of coffee and canned goods, a mixture of comfort and necessity. Long tables were stacked with boxes of rice, beans, and bread, some fresh, some near expiration, but still good. Volunteers bustled about, sorting and organizing, their voices weaving together in a chorus of ordinary service. Daniel stood at the edge, uncertain, until Pastor Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "Glad you came, son," the pastor said warmly. "Start here. Hand out bread as folks come through. Look them in the eye. Make sure they know they're seen." Daniel nodded, though nervousness fluttered in his chest. He took his place behind the table. The line stretched down the hallway, people of every age and background waiting patiently. Some avoided eye contact, embarrassed to be there. Others chatted quietly with one another, carrying stories he could only guess at. The first woman stepped forward, her coat too thin for the cold. Daniel held out a loaf of bread. "Here you go," he said softly. She glanced up, surprised by the gentleness in his voice, and gave a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered. The simple exchange struck him more deeply than he expected. Each person who passed reminded him of his own nights of hunger, his own pride resisting help. Now standing on the other side of the table, he saw the humanity in every face, not weakness but resilience. Hours passed quickly. Daniel handed out bread, carried boxes, and helped families load groceries into bags. A little boy clutched a can of soup like treasure, grinning at him as if he were a hero. Something inside Daniel shifted. He realized he was no longer thinking of himself first. The act of giving, even when it didn't erase his own struggles, filled him with a strength that felt unshakable. During a break, Pastor Williams handed him a cup of coffee. "How does it feel?" Daniel took a sip, his hands warming around the cup. "Strange. I came here thinking I was the one who needed help. But maybe this is what I needed all along. To stop looking only at myself." The pastor smiled knowingly. "Service has a way of healing the heart. When you lift someone else, you find yourself lifted too." In the days that followed, Daniel returned again and again. He began to recognize faces in the line, an elderly man who always wore the same cap, a young mother balancing two toddlers on her hip, a teenager with tired eyes who never took more than a single bag. He learned their names, listened to their stories, and offered more than food. He offered dignity, a smile, a reminder they weren't forgotten. One afternoon, as the line thinned, a group of restless boys lingered near the door. They were no older than 16, their jackets torn, their words sharp with frustration. Daniel approached cautiously. "You guys hungry?" he asked. They exchanged wary glances before one shrugged. "Yeah, but we're not charity cases." Daniel understood that pride. He smiled faintly. "Neither am I. But I know what it's like to be hungry. Come on, help me carry these boxes and then you can take what you need. Deal?" The boys hesitated, then nodded. Together they hauled crates of canned goods from the back. As they worked, Daniel talked with them, not lecturing, just listening. By the time they left with bags in hand, their eyes held less defiance and more respect. That night, Daniel walked home with tired muscles but a full heart. For the first time in years, he felt he was part of something bigger than himself. The ripple of kindness was spreading, not just through the food he gave, but through the dignity he offered. Lying on Emily's couch, he whispered to himself, "This is what it means to live." And though he didn't yet know where it would lead, he sensed that the path unfolding was no accident. The weeks passed, and Daniel's routine at the food bank became steady. Each morning he walked through the city with a sense of purpose, greeting familiar faces along the way. He had little money and no job to call his own, but he carried something greater than either, the certainty that his life mattered again. One crisp afternoon, after unloading crates with a few of the boys he had befriended, Pastor Williams pulled him aside. "Daniel, can I have a word?" They stepped into the pastor's office, a modest room lined with books and photographs of church events. Pastor Williams leaned against the desk, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "You've been faithful here," the pastor said. "People notice, the way you look them in the eye, the way you treat them with respect. It's more than handing out food. You've got a gift for reaching people." Daniel shifted uneasily. "I don't know about that. I know what it feels like to be in their shoes." "That's exactly why it matters," Williams replied, "and I think you're ready for something more." He slid a business card across the desk. "There's a community center on the south side. They're hiring full-time. They need someone who can organize volunteers, connect with kids, build trust. It pays, Daniel. Not much, but enough to live on. And it would use what you've been doing here." Daniel stared at the card, the black letters blurring for a moment. A job, stability, a chance to pay rent again, to stand on his own. His chest tightened with a surge of relief and hesitation. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because you've already been doing the work," the pastor said. "You've walked through fire, son. And now you can help others find their way out of it too." That night, Daniel lay on Emily's couch with the card in his hand. He imagined himself in that role, earning money, standing on his own 2 feet, proving to Emily and himself that he wasn't a failure. Yet another thought stirred uneasily within him. What if the job pulled him away from the food bank? From the small but powerful moments of service that had changed him? Would he lose the very heart of what had given his life new meaning? He turned the card over in his hands, remembering the words Jesus had spoken in that vision. What you gave away was not lost. It was the beginning of what will be found. Emily noticed his restlessness as she passed through the room. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. Daniel looked up at her. "Pastor Williams offered me a job lead, real work, but I don't know if taking it means leaving behind what I've found here." She sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. "Daniel, maybe it isn't about leaving something behind. Maybe it's about carrying it with you. What you've learned here, the way you've changed, it doesn't disappear just because you're in a different place." He considered her words, his heart torn. The offer felt like a gift, yet it demanded a choice: security or surrender, provision or passion. Later that night, as the city lights flickered outside the window, Daniel closed his eyes and prayed. Not the desperate, hollow prayers of his past, but a genuine plea. "Lord, I don't want to lose what you've shown me. I don't want to chase comfort and forget compassion. Help me choose the path that honors you, even if it scares me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried peace, a gentle reminder that whichever door he stepped through, the key was to keep his hands open. Daniel opened his eyes, the card still resting on his chest. A decision was waiting, and by morning, he knew he would have to make it. The morning light spilled into Emily's apartment as Daniel sat at the table with the business card in one hand and his notebook in the other. He had written pros and cons until the pages blurred, but the truth was simpler than ink could capture. It wasn't about the job alone. It was about who he wanted to be. When Emily walked in, still in her scrubs after a night shift, she glanced at him with a tired smile. "Made your decision?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'll take the job, but not just for the paycheck. I think it's where I can keep serving, just in a different way." Her smile deepened, pride softening her weary eyes. "I'm glad. You've come a long way, Daniel." He chuckled, a sound more genuine than it had been in years. "Not by myself. If it wasn't for you, for Pastor Williams, for people like Martha, and even Ray, I don't know where I'd be. They gave when they didn't have much, and that changed me." That afternoon, Daniel walked into the community center for the first time. The building buzzed with life. Children playing basketball in the gym, volunteers stacking books in a small library, young men gathered at a table filling out job applications. The director, a woman with determined eyes and a firm handshake, welcomed him. "We need people who can see past the surface," she said, "people who know what struggle feels like." "Can you do that?" Daniel met her gaze, steady and sure. "Yes, I can." The weeks that followed tested him, but also fulfilled him in ways he hadn't imagined. He organized food drives, mentored teenagers on the edge of giving up, and stood beside single parents trying to rebuild their lives. Each day reminded him of the night he gave away his last piece of bread, the night he had nothing left but chose to give anyway. That moment had opened a door no rejection could shut. One evening, after finishing a long shift, Daniel walked through the city streets, under a canopy of glowing lights. The air was cool, filled with the scent of roasted peanuts from a street vendor and the distant rhythm of music from a passing car. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a shadow drifting unnoticed. He felt alive. He stopped by a quiet park bench, one that reminded him of Brookdale, and whispered into the stillness, "Thank you." The memory of Jesus' words returned, clear as the night he had heard them. "What you gave to me. And what you gave was not lost." Tears filled his eyes, but they weren't born of despair. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition that his journey, every hunger, every rejection, every choice had led him here. When he returned to Emily's apartment later that night, she was waiting with 2 mugs of tea. They sat together, no walls between them anymore, just the warmth of family restored. "You seem different," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "I am. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because I finally understand what matters. It's not about holding on to what little I have, it's about giving, trusting, and letting God fill the rest." Emily reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I'm proud of you." He met her eyes, steady. "I'm just finally living the way I should have all along." The journey that began with a single act of generosity had transformed him completely. Daniel was no longer the man who sat in silence with an eviction notice on his door. He was a man of service, of hope, of faith renewed, and his story was far from over. Before we close, if this journey touched you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Stories like Daniel's remind us that even in the darkest places, one choice can change everything. And if you're ready for more, click the video on your screen now. You don't want to miss the next story.